All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Entry Level Left. I'm Jared, currently pouring one out for King Soleimani.
Yeah, I'm Nathan. I'm in character, and by in character I mean drunk right now. So
No, you're not.
quite feeling it.
Yeah, and I'm Matt. Also drinking some of that Bacardi and Coke Zero, that Boomer Daddy juice.
Put entry level left to get 20% off your next
Yeah.
purchase.
Input at entry level left on your next Amazon purchase. Shout out to our sponsor, Daddy Beso. So yeah, just if you guys are tuning in for the first time, you guys and gals, we are on all platforms pretty much. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook at Entry Level Left. We've got a Patreon. You can support us on PayPal if you'd rather do a single donation. Anywhere you want to find us, you can stream us, download our podcast, all episodes for free. We really want to provide this content to everyone with no barrier. But if you like what we do, please consider supporting us on either PayPal or Patreon. But with that said, let's get into it.
All right, so tonight we are talking manufacturing consent, specifically as it relates to the media, capitalism, all things war and imperialism. Y'all know the story.
Yeah, I think at this point, our listeners should know
Are you guys
Yeah.
tired
it's all
yet?
connected.
Yes. So, what do we mean by manufacturing consent in the media, and why is it relevant today?
Well, I think we probably stole this term from Noam Chomsky and our good friend Edward Herman.
And by probably we
Herman.
mean we did. Season
Yeah,
Definitely
I mean,
did.
it's definitely become part of the vernacular.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the if you want to take 2 or 3 hours to go through Noam Chomsky, you're going to hear
Which
a
we
million
don't.
different examples of how the U.S. does this.
Yeah.
But I think the most pertinent part of manufacturing consent is what they called the 5 filters of editorial bias, and I think these things are really, really important. So I want to take a minute just to go over a few of them. So number 1, size, ownership, and profit orientation. So that means that the barrier to entry into any sort of media is huge, right? Like it's pretty obvious that the only type of people who get into media in the first place are usually giant companies, like
Right.
Turner Broadcasting or like News Corp and things like that, like Rupert Murdoch and stuff. Those are the only types of people
Yeah.
who can just open up a media empire. Getting followers, having a creative team, having regular content, all that stuff costs money. It takes time.
Right.
So it costs millions and millions of dollars to get in. So just the nature of getting into the business already kind of presents a bias, because to have a news company means that it's owned by a billionaire. It means that it's in the interest of a billionaire or of a millionaire.
Right, like
you know
the
what I mean?
Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos.
Right, but even before that, it's like it takes some like massive like quote unquote like philanthropy effort to
Yeah.
like get some major media off the ground.
Yeah, and you're right too. It's like, in addition, once those media companies are started, the only people who end up owning them are these giant conglomerates.
Yeah.
Like Disney bought 21st Media
Yeah.
Fox, which is pretty much all of Fox except for the news part.
Right, or some fucking hedge fund. Or
They
Yeah,
have
Disney
ABC,
bought ABC,
ESPN, Pixar, Miramax, Marvel. They own all of that.
Yeah, which is like, it means that every company is at least filtered through a millionaire board of
right.
directors.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The second point that they hit on in these 5 filters of editorial bias is the advertising license to do business. So what this means is that not only do you need some sort of like billionaire angel investor to get off the ground, you also have to have some sort of business sponsor you.
Right.
You know what I mean? And this is what keeps the independent media from being the big media, right? The
Right.
big media has sponsorships from Keurig. They have sponsorships from like Starbucks and
Ads,
McDonald's and
essentially,
things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But those companies will never go out of the way to sponsor something that's like more radical.
Basically-
any sort of dissent or anything.
Yeah,
you know?
basically what it amounts to is like the ability to use capital to disseminate their product or their enterprise more than an independent media would. But just to give like a statistical like breakdown to people, as of at least 2011, the media in the U.S. is controlled by about 6 companies with about 200 ultra wealthy shareholders, and they own all of Western media. And the media in this country, in the U.S., is very consolidated. And as of 2011, it's never been as consolidated as it is. About 90% of what we read, watch, or listen to is owned entirely by 6 companies, and those companies are GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. And of those 6 companies, people may be familiar, but you have Comcast, NBC, Universal Pictures, Focus Features, Fox, Wall Street Journal, New York Post, ABC, ESPN, Pixar, Miramax, Marvel Studios, like we mentioned with Disney. Viacom has MTV, Nick Jr., BET, CMT, Paramount Pictures, Time Warner, CNN, HBO, Time and Warner Brothers, CBS, Showtime, the Smithsonian Channel, and the NFL.com, Jeopardy, and 60 Minutes. So a lot of what we're seeing, reading, and understanding that helps us orient our place in the universe, the country, a lot of it is coming from these 6 media giants.
Yeah, that's kind of playing like into the first point. Going back to the advertising too, I think like having ads is so important that when you get something that's really dissenting, like you see a lot of these leftist podcasts or leftist YouTube channel, they don't get ads, like conventional ads. They get maybe like at best like dick pill ads they get like,
gas station boner pills.
Yeah, they get that, or like antimicrobial underwear and shit like that. They don't have like legitimate ads like the big dogs do.
Or they just run on Patreon.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is even if they do ads, most of the revenue comes from Patreon. So there's like a huge disadvantage just with that point alone. The third point they bring up in that book in particular is sourcing mass media news. So what this means is that every single outlet needs to find a place to get their news from, right? And this in itself is a competition, right? So you want to have people in the government, people who are insiders, billionaires, celebrities. You want to have those people in your back pocket ready to go at all times. And that means you have to appease them. You have to keep them happy. That might mean writing like a fluff piece for them. It might mean like having a certain sort of like air about your content that kind of invites them onto the show. It might even just be things like, I don't know, like running certain ads or certain kinds of stories that they asked for on the side. Trump was like notorious for that. He used to work really closely with the tabloids, and he would give them a bunch of different scoops, all in trade for essentially them to write a fluff piece about how rich he is, or how
to get notoriety and to get exposure. Really, what it amounts to.
There's also a fear about what even legitimate news companies, I say quote square quotes over legitimate, but like New York Times or Washington Post, they're at this point, they're at the point where they even sometimes get passes, like press passes, denied for the White House, or they get it denied for the Trump campaign trail and things like that. Like at this point, like they need to fight for access. And so when it comes to these people who are like in the White House asking the president questions or asking the press secretary questions, like you have to wonder, like, are they throwing softballs because like they don't want to get kicked out, they don't want to cause a stir? You know what I mean? Moving forward here, the fourth one is flack and enforcers, and I think this is one that we can all probably relate to. And a lot of times, media outlets get bullied into complacency by either like other outlets or by like special interest groups, right?
Of course.
So that means when you see like any sort of bad take, or sometimes, God forbid, someone makes a mistake, you see like Fox News, for example, just bear down on how CNN is illegitimate, or New York Times is illegitimate, which like in some cases they are, but in most cases it's like it's a small mistake, or it's something that's just being blown completely out of proportion.
Or you have like the actual State Department, like if they're doing like shit that exposes like failures abroad, or like mismanagement of funds abroad, or isn't like lining the fucking pavement for another war, you can have literal intervention from the government.
Yeah. I think the important thing is like when you hear the term like corporate journalism, it's kind of an oxymoron. Because if you think about an organization like the Washington Post, for example, that organization's sole purpose can't be to make money and then also be expected to tell the truth about things that may hurt the company financially or the corporation financially. It's just, you start to see in real time that these things become a conflict of interest to them. So you can see the media bias and the framing of these things quite clearly.
And sometimes if you have enough money, you can just sue publications out of existence.
Right, yeah.
Like Peter Thiel got really upset that Gawker called him out for potentially, I'll say potentially here so we don't get sued out of existence, for being maybe gay. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, large emphasis on maybe, guys.
Like Pete Buttigieg. Maybe gay.
He might be. I'm not 100% sure. He
kidding.
hasn't really commented on that yet. But in any case, he backed Hulk Hogan's lawsuit, like funded the whole thing, and pretty much got them sued out of existence. Not only them, but their editors too are like completely bankrupt.
Right.
You know, and it's very scary to think that an individual can just decide like, I don't want this outlet to exist.
Yeah.
You know, this one we're aware of because it's pretty well documented. But
Right.
you have to think like, how often does this happen on the down low? You know
Right.
what I mean? And then the fifth one, and this one's a little bit more abstract. It started off in the original publication of Manufacturing Consent as anti-communism, right? So all the media was being filtered through an anti-communist lens, right? Later on, Chomsky changed this to anti-terrorism, right? So everything had to be through an anti-terrorism lens, like kind of post-1990s, about in that era.
Right.
Well, yeah, this book was revised like 20 years later,
Right.
after the fall of the Soviet Union, to kind of like put things in perspective as the world had changed. I mean, that in and of itself is kind of dubious, the way that like Chomsky kind of like frames that,
Yeah,
but
right.
there's a lot of like context to it that needs to be
what I
understood.
think like would probably describe it the best, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, was describing it as the big other, right? There always needs to be this sort of idea of like there's something else out there that's an existential crisis
Right.
Yeah.
to our existence.
Right.
And the media needs to always acknowledge that, right?
Right.
Even not even just the media, even politicians need to acknowledge this. It's like just recently Elizabeth Warren had responded to Iran, right? She had, or the Iran crisis, right? Of course, Soleimani was
Killing
just killed
of Soleimani, yeah.
not too long ago here, and so she responded, but saying like, yes, okay, of course I acknowledge that they're terrorists. Of course I acknowledge that Americans were killed, and this and this and this and that, and like before she can even get into her point of framing it. Before she can even get to the point of being anti-war or against this sort of intervention, she has to admit first,
Right.
okay,
That he was a
of
bad
course there's
guy.
a terrorist
Right.
problem. Of course there's a terrorist problem. We can't deny that part. Of course there's terrorism problem. And
Right.
at that point, it feels like you've already lost the battle.
Well,
you know what
yeah,
I mean? You're
and-
already admitting like, yes, there is a terrorist problem. We already acknowledge that this big
Right.
other is out there. It's an existential crisis. What are we going to do about it? And you've lost it before you've even made your point.
Right,
you know?
and because all you're doing is like kind of re-emphasizing like the necessity for like war and imperialism, but now you're walking it back after that. It kind of makes you come across as like weak, quote unquote. But also too, it's like, it's the same thing with the way we talk about war and like just the incessant like imperial death machine that the U.S. produces. It's like if you're an American politician and you're actually against that, you can't just outright state that. You have to like first like embellish the troops and like talk about how much you love them and like worship everything that they do and have great respect for the U.S. military and their bravery. And then, by the way, like war sucks and like we shouldn't be doing this because
if that, you're lucky if that's what you get.
Because if you don't do that, then the media will paint you as like you hate America, you hate the troops, and that's why you're anti-war.
Yeah, I think particularly this last content filter in terms of like editorial bias with the anti-communist / terrorism sentiment, it's particularly important in the way of it boiling down to this underlying feeling that the state and the media apparatus is always needing to find a big unknown boogeyman to create some sort of a united front. And we'll talk about this later when we get into the way, like the mechanics of manufacturing consent. But for listeners that may be just tuning into our pod for the first time, to give more of sort of like a background on like what manufacturing consent is this idea where the media drums up these, stories that may not be wholly false, but they're postured in a way that kind of they misrepresent the entire situation, or they'll misrepresent historical context of the conflict, especially we'll get into later with the Iran and Iraq conflict, but they'll misrepresent specific details or situations with regards to these, greater conflicts in the Middle East and so on, in order to drum up sort of a nationalistic or racist or, big other, so that the people in the United States, low information voters, low information people in general, can sort of feel united in a whether it's a nationalistic or a racist way or, an anti-Muslim way, to sort of manufacture this consent for war. But we have to, as leftists, look at really what the mechanics of this are and who's profiting from this consent that the media is trying to drum up.
Well, also, too, I mean, yeah, they're essentially lying with facts. I mean, they're taking things that may actually be happening on the ground, instability that may be happening on the ground, tidbits of information that are true, and weaving them together to like kind of lay out a narrative that sounds believable enough for, as you had said, like the average American citizen to kind of say, yeah, I feel in my gut that, you know,
these are just bad people.
These are bad people,
yeah.
and that's wrong. But one thing I want to highlight a quote actually that kind of relates to something that we were talking about earlier. You know, Matt, when you were talking about how there's a filter through which things must go, because if they don't sort of like align with the like elite status quo, then they're not something that would be publishable or acceptable like in a mainstream news source. And this is a quote from Matt Taibbi, who's one of my favorite modern journalists, more progressive guy. He states, "There's definitely a schism of opinion up above, though I try to avoid the term elites. The concept of manufacturing consent is that the conflicts we see in the media, say between Democrats and Republicans, for example, are not really conflicts. The conflict is all a show. What we see is the strip of acceptable thought to those up top." And what I think he's really getting at there is like, and actually it's something that Chomsky has said in an interview a long time ago, because he was asked by a journalist who said, well, no one's told me what to say. No one's told me to ask you certain questions. No one's told me to frame things a certain way. No one's told me to have the beliefs that I have. And he says, I'm not saying someone told you that you have to have the beliefs that you have, but if you didn't have the beliefs that you have, you would not be sitting where you are currently.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it is. Like, it's not as easy to say as like, okay, you know, Jeff Bezos is dictating to his Washington Post employees that they need to report on certain things. It's not that they're outright lying about what's happening in Venezuela. I mean, they are. But like, it's not like they're just like conjuring shit up out of their ass about certain things. They're taking bits and pieces of truth, weaving it together with he said, she said, or sources, you know, unnamed sources, which are always from the fucking U.S. State Department about certain things. And they're telling you a believable tale. And the filter is really in terms of who is doing the storytelling. Because, again, what Chomsky said, it's not that they're being told how to think. It's that they would not be where they are if they didn't think the way that they did.
I mean, you can think about it like if Jeff Bezos is going to go ahead and hire somebody to run his newspaper, he's going to have an interview with them, and he's going to make sure that his values align with that person. And that person's going to interview somebody and make sure their values align. And that person's going to interview an editor. And that editor is going to make sure that their values align. And it works all the way down to the reporters.
Well, not only that, but like when you're being hired for a job, they're always like, whether they're values or whether they're objectives for your job, you're being paid to do a certain like job. And it's not so much the values of individuals being like trickled down to other individuals. It's more like this overall enterprise exists for a specific reason.
Right.
Now, to be more specific for people that may be, you know, tuning in for the first time, again, this manufacturing consent is a concept we're talking about, you know, a greater concept described in the book by, you know, Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of Mass Media. But therein, they describe that the U.S. Mass communication media is basically an effective and powerful ideological institution that carries out a system-supportive propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions, which is very important, we'll come back to maybe later, but also self-censorship. So like Jared was talking about, they'll leave out certain details to create a narrative, but there's also a lot of internalized assumptions. Like, take, for example, when September 11th happened and the U.S. media drummed up a bunch of support for war, and it was almost, you know, growing up in that era, it was almost unanimous. Everyone was united against this, like, ambiguous idea of terrorism, and we invaded Iraq, even though they had no connection to, the terrorist attack on 9/11. We invaded that country under false presumptions of weapons of mass destruction, so on and so forth. But there are internalized assumptions that developed in the American working class and generally the, low information voters that terrorists are all Middle East, like all Middle Easterners are terrorists. All of these like internalized assumptions that the media has created help manufacture a sort of consent for imperialism, for war, for destruction, for suffering. But ultimately, this manufacturing of consent is a way to distract people from the profit motive behind going to war and manufacturing munitions, manufacturing bombs, training soldiers, recruiting soldiers into the U.S. military, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that this is a whole apparatus in conjunction with things like the carceral state that we've talked about in previous episodes, in conjunction with the dysfunctional healthcare system that we have in the U.S., in conjunction with the dysfunctional education system that we have in the U.S. All of these factors go into creating, with the media, sort of a material condition that primes people to have these internalized assumptions.
Yeah. Newspapers, like, they're not strategically, like, posting articles to avoid panic, right? Like, if panic sells, they're going to do it every single time. You know what I mean? And, like, for example, like, I was going through and sending you guys headlines from CNN earlier this week, and there was articles that were speculating about Iranian cyber attacks, Iranian propaganda networks, which seems very similar to Russian propaganda networks. Russian arms supplied in Iran. They were doing things like spotlighting American citizens who have been locked up in Iran, and they were posting articles. One of my favorite headlines so far was, quote, "Every U.S. citizen is now a target." Right? When you open the article, it's a little bit different. They're talking specifically about people who are in Iraq or Iran.
Right.
But at the same time, like, when you post these sensational headlines, like, you are asking for people to buy into this idea of like, oh no, this is like the panic. This is the big unknown. It's like, there's people out there who fundamentally don't agree with me. We need to go to war and make sure that they eventually at some point are going to be civilized.
Or it's like that meme where it's like, how did our freedoms get over here?
Right.
How did our freedoms get holed up in the Middle East, and why do we have to go over there? I mean, like, it really, realistically, it's like all oil infrastructure.
Right. One of the things kind of about all this manufacturing consent stuff, like, doesn't make me entirely cynical, about, oddly enough, about the American public is actually the rise of Trump, right? Because, as we've talked about, like, how these articles are sort of crafted so that the average American citizen, like, believes them and whatnot, Trump is sort of a reaction to this, like, ongoing manufacturing consent of the media, right? Like, who is his, like, number one scapegoat at his rallies, right? It's like the fake news, the media, and he's kind of playing the same game that the American mainstream media has played for so long, as in lying with facts, where you take tidbits of true information and you kind of throw in a bunch of bullshit. And that's exactly what Trump does. I mean, he's perfected it. He's taken... he takes little tidbits of information that have a slight grain of truth to them, namely like how the American media is full of shit and, bought off and, quote unquote, the swamp.
Yeah.
And, runs with it and targets them. And it has drummed up this massive support of, unfortunately, because it's from the right, just completely like anti-truth nonsense,
like imperial, like war hawking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like it's like, as they say, like, I know it's a very wonky term, but like a post-fact era.
One thing to your point I want to mention is like this idea when we're talking about like the conflict in Iran that's now developed over the past like week or so with General Qasem Soleimani. I mean, you've seen tabloids and newspapers all talking about how he was the number one bad guy.
Right.
But if you look back a couple of years, like you see, Soleimani lauded in the media just a few years earlier because he had been an indispensable figure in the fight against the Taliban and ISIS. So it's like clearly there's some framing that the media is doing here to be congruent with the U.S. State Department and their goals or their objectives, but it's not necessarily what you're getting is the truth. It's more of a contorted, it's like a manufactured consent for what is going on when the media tells you that this is the world's number one bad guy. But like you look back a few years ago and this guy was, helping the U.S. fight against the Taliban and ISIS. And not only that, but like when he was taken out, he was on a diplomatic mission in Iraq.
And we've seen this shit before countless times throughout U.S. history, even recent U.S. history. I mean, in this case, it was Soleimani, who was once good, now he's bad. Before him, it was Saddam, who was once good, who then became bad. Before him, it was fucking Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen, who was good, and then now they're bad. And where we kind of, because our militaristic style, see our episode on imperialism as so much about like this opportunistic wielding of political power that, today's good guy is tomorrow's number one enemy. And just to put this into historical context, I mean, I know the comparison's been made kind of a lot lately, but it can't be stated enough, honestly, in my opinion. I mean, let's talk about the Iraq War and like how similar this is. I mean, you had during the time running up to the Iraq War, you had the entirety of the New York Times saying from anonymous sources, aka Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. We can't risk this. They were connecting dots that weren't there between him and 9/11, just as Mike Pence did recently. I mean, you had Joe Scarborough, who's like supposed to be this like moderate liberal Republican, on MSNBC saying that, for 6 months now, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld have been telling the world that the people of Iraq need to be liberated from Saddam Hussein's bloody reign. The past 3 weeks have shown us just how right these three men have been, namely the 3 weeks running up to them drumming up the fact that he had weapons of mass destruction. Fox News, of course, reiterating this. It's just like, it's one right after the other. They play the exact same fucking shit like on repeat, and somehow we continue to just abide and let it happen.
Well, what I will say is like a particular quote or phrase that I heard on, I think it was Chapo that said it was, the empire has no permanent friends,
Right.
only permanent interests.
Right.
And the permanent interest is capital accumulation and resource dominance. At any point in time, Saddam, we let him go during the Persian Gulf War, and then came back that he was, this person that needed to be taken out, the number one bad guy. Then it was Osama bin Laden. Now it's, Qasem Soleimani. And it really highlights how the U.S. imperial media and the war machine in general, so there's no permanent allies, only permanent objectives and permanent interests.
And one thing, just to add on to that point, in case anyone at home is confused, it's like, well, what does this have to do with capital or anything like that? Let us also not forget that even right now, if you go to the gas pump, right, gas is cheaper than it was substantially from however many years ago when it was almost like $4 or $5 a gallon. Let us not forget why that is the case. The Saudi Arabians are pumping a shit ton of oil on the market with U.S. support to destabilize three major oil-producing economies: Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. It is no surprise that shortly after that, all three of those countries were hit with, in addition to that, incredible economic sanctions, have thrown all of those fucking countries into turmoil. It is at the same time that you've seen incessant drive for imperial efforts and war efforts against Iran, whether it's from the right or left in the U.S. regarding Russia and Putin's connection to this, that, or the other. Venezuela has been an incessant boogeyman of the United States and South America. And it's not coincidence. These things are not coincidence. They're all deeply connected to one another.
Yeah, and it even came out recently that Juan Guaido is actually bankrolled by the CIA. This stuff it's the varnish is coming off, folks. We know that this is engineered. And at this point, it's just kind of ridiculous to believe these same lies that got us in these forever wars. If you look at the profits of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and all these other war contractor companies, they're shooting up.
Right.
And it should come as no surprise that this is all engineered. This is all specific, and it's all intentional. It's a market war. It's a class war. this is so apparent now at this point. It's kind of like, ridiculous to even keep speculating about whether the U.S. is in the right or in the wrong. The intention of this media apparatus is to drum up this U.S. exceptionalism so that people in the U.S., low information voters, otherwise ignorant people, can just rest on their laurels to say, oh, these are just bad people. These are terrorists. They need freedom. We need to liberate them. But look deeper and you'll see that it's all about oil infrastructure. It's all about resource dominance and power and control.
And if you're wondering too, like, why would, a power like a major oil power like Saudi Arabia lower their prices to assist an American imperial effort or something like that? Keep in mind that them doing that also destabilized American fracking companies, which the U.S. was willing to take a hit on to benefit Saudi Arabian oil interests, so long as it advanced American imperial interests for more fucking oil. So these things are all connected. They don't happen in a vacuum. It's not conspiracy, although it may seem like it. But all of this, has a broader purpose.
And even going back into like the historical context of our conflict with Iran, back in the 50s, Mohammed Mossadegh was a figure that was elected, and he tried to nationalize the Iranian oil. And you can see, if you look back in history and read about it, that the CIA overthrew their democratically elected government for the purposes of oil. So it's not like, these people are just, savages or whatever the media tries to paint them as, like Islamic terrorists, whatever. There's a deep history, an economic history, as to why these things are happening still in the current day. You can't just look at things as they're presented to you by the media without going back and trying to understand the rivalries and the resentments that have developed as a result of U.S. imperial actions.
And keep in mind, too, like Mossadegh was a secular socialist who, upon nationalizing oil, immediately the U.S. State Department drummed up, this guy is close, because of his socialist leanings and him nationalizing oil. He's close with the Soviets, and we can't have that. And they used the threat of world global communism as an excuse to topple a democratically elected leader, impose the Shah, which later led to the current leadership of the Ayatollah.
Yeah, and whose fault is that? The U.S.
I don't know.
So with all of that said, let us now introduce a new entry-level left segment of Cursed Liberal Opinions. And Nathan, I'm interested, who this week is your cursed liberal opinion?
Well,
or what is your cursed liberal opinion?
This week, for my cursed liberal opinion, I'm going to bring up a classical liberal opinion from
nice. Okay.
longtime and failed Democrat Joe Lieberman.
Whoa,
right?
Oh, man. Blast from the past.
He wrote recently an op-ed
Oh
in
my
the
God,
Wall
I
Street
forgot who
Journal.
that even was. Yeah,
Yep,
okay,
yep,
sorry,
yep.
continue.
For people who are listening, Joe Lieberman is the guy who essentially removed the public option
Right.
from Obamacare, right?
Right.
That was just a little bit too left for his comfort.
Yeah.
So he made sure, of course, that was removed completely from Obamacare, right?
He looks like that guy from SpongeBob, not Mermaid Man. What's the other? Barnacle Boy.
Barnacle Boy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah.
Joe Lieberman looks like Barnacle Boy.
Yeah.
And he served in the Senate, I think, from like 1989-ish to about 2013. So
Yeah.
he has been.
He's a
he was a long time Democratic
Yeah.
senator.
He was the original neolib before like neoliberalism had taken its lefter turn.
But he recently wrote an op-ed for the very communist Wall Street Journal.
Ooh. Red Scare. Ooh.
And I'm gonna skip through this a little bit,
Right.
but I'll try
Go
to
for
cover
it.
most of the points here.
Give us the hits, baby.
Let's lead with this hook here. President Trump's order to take out Qasem Soleimani was morally, constitutionally, and strategically correct. It deserves more bipartisan support than the begrudging or negative reactions it has received thus far from fellow Democrats. Right? So he's already starting off pretty hard here. He's saying that, the general consensus of the Democrats, the people who are, saying, hey, we should probably not escalate war. He's saying that's all fucking wrong.
Hot centrist take. Is he going to be Buttigieg's running mate?
I don't know. He might be. Maybe Biden.
That's his VP.
Republic. Oh, he's not a Republican.
He would totally be Biden's running mate. Oh my God, you heard it here. You heard it here first, folks. Lieberman, aka Barnacle Boy, will 100% be Biden's running mate if he's the nominee.
Pull him from retirement. He goes on to say the president's decision was bold and unconventional. It's understandable that the political class should have questions about it, but it isn't understandable that all the questions are being raised by Democrats and all the praise is coming from Republicans. That divided response suggests that partisanship has infected and disabled so much of U.S. domestic policy that it also determines our elected leaders' responses to major foreign policy events and national security issues.
Fucking God.
Even the killing of a man responsible for murdering hundreds of Americans.
Hundreds
and
of
Americans. To kill
thousands
more.
Hundreds of Americans.
Yeah, it's not like we put ourselves over there in the first place.
It's not like we killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians and fucking children and shit.
After invading on a false flag,
a sovereign nation on literal lies.
On literal lies after the Saudis actually, were
literally
behind 9/11.
The Saudis did 9/11. You heard it here, folks.
Yeah.
Make that trend. Hashtag the Saudis did 9/11.
The Saudis did 9/11 and we're supporting their despotic leader and supplying arms to them and other things like that. Right. So
I'm just curious. He says that partisanship is affecting our response. I want to know what the bipartisan response would be like, because the Republicans want war. The Democrats are like, we don't want the aesthetics of war. I don't know how
but they handed them a huge budget.
Yeah,
for war.
How can you get more? How can you get any less partisan? I mean, I don't. Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway.
Yeah, I don't want to bleed your ears out. So I'm going to skip the part where he describes, a history of bipartisanship during World War II and dealing with the Nazis. And he also talks a little bit about
the last good war we fought.
Yeah. He also talks a little bit about how, all the Soleimani war crimes that were committed, et cetera, et cetera. So you can get that from some other source. I'm not going to go over that.
Because Blackwater never happened.
And then he goes, from the perspective of American values and interest, it's impossible to mourn the death of such a man, and Democrats haven't.
I genuinely mourn the death of King Soleimani.
Their response thus far has been yes, but adding worries that Soleimani's death will provoke a violent response from Iran. Democrats have also suggested that the Trump administration has no coherent strategy toward Iran, or that Mr. Trump shouldn't have acted without notice or permission from Congress. And actually, I will say, I feel like he's a little bit right there. I feel like the liberal response is, you killed Soleimani, but you didn't go quite through the right channels.
See, that's it. That's it. That's what I was just going to say. The nonpartisan response that he's looking for is, I would have liked everything that happened to definitely have happened. I just would have liked to have been notified about it, which I think is the Democrats' position, with the exception of Sanders and Ilhan and AOC and all them. So again, let me go back to Matt Taibbi's statement. There's definitely a schism of opinion up above, though I try to avoid the term elites. The concept of manufacturing consent is that of the conflicts we see in the media between Democrats and Republicans, for example. However, they are not really conflicts. The conflicts is all a show. What we see is the strip of acceptable thought to those up top.
It's theater.
There you fucking go, folks. There you fucking go.
It's theater to set the expectation of what is acceptable, and it's all to frame and posture for the sake of mostly corporate interests. So, I mean, all media in some sense is biased. What you have to understand is, whose narrative is mostly fabricated and which narrative is more based on facts than anything else.
He goes on to say, if we allow fear of a self-declared enemy like Iran to dictate our actions, we will only encourage them to come after us and our allies more aggressively. Some Democrats have said that killing Soleimani will lead us to war with Iran. In fact, Soleimani and the Quds Force have been at war with the U.S. for years. It is more likely that his death will diminish the chances of a wider conflict because the demonstration of our willingness to kill him will give the Iranian leaders, and probably others like Kim Jong-un, got to include that, right? Much to fear, which I think is insane because that sort of philosophy is literally just war justification.
Right.
It's why insurgencies exist. It's why this general idea of America is imperialist exists in the first place. This is just self-perpetuating that entire narrative.
Well, also the people of Iran loved the fuck out of that guy. Millions of people poured into the streets.
Yeah, more people than at Trump and Obama's inauguration.
Right, to mourn his death. Also, he's already been replaced by Soleimani's right-hand guy, his protege. So, all we did was stomp on the fucking hornet's nest and kill the queen fucking bee and did nothing to quell the fact that we have enraged an entire population of people.
All of this is just drumming up more support for corporations.
Also, too,
Yeah.
the sanctions
War
that we've
contract.
imposed on them have only strengthened that leadership over there. They also now they have no economic prosperity to look forward to. One of their leaders was just killed. They're ready to fucking die for the cause at this point. You know what I mean?
Well, the U.S. war machine, their intent is not to win. Their intent is to prolong this conflict and protract it so that, military contractors, military weapons manufacturers, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, all the other ones, their stock prices are shooting up. It's so clear. It's beyond clear what the point of this is.
Also, too, Iran is literally like the Vietnam of the Middle East. We would get spanked if we went over there. Not in the sense that we wouldn't unleash absolute
We just bomb the shit out of them.
Right.
Classic.
But if we put boots on the ground over there, oh my God.
So he goes on to say, the claim by some Democrats that Mr. Trump has no authority to order this attack without congressional approval is constitutionally untenable and practically senseless. Authority to act quickly to eliminate a threat to the U.S. is inherent in the powers granted to the president by the Constitution. It defies common sense to argue that the president must notify Congress or begin a formal process of authorization before acting on an imminent threat. And just to say, it's this is exactly why we say do not argue law. Don't argue policy with people. It's argue morals. Was it right for us to attack Iran?
Right.
Don't sit there and debate did he have the authority to do it or not? It's that doesn't matter.
Or just ask
we need to
why
condemn
did
it
it happen?
overall.
Or just ask why the fuck did it happen to begin with? What is the broader interest here?
Yeah, he goes on to say, on many occasions, President Obama sensibly ordered drone strikes on dangerous terrorist leaders, including U.S.-born Anwar al-Awlaki. He did so without specific congressional authorization and without significant Democratic opposition.
Which is true.
Mr. Obama also brought justice, quote unquote, to Osama bin Laden without prior explicit congressional approval. And this goes back to what we always say is so fucking what? Of course, we also agree Obama is a war criminal.
Right.
We're not going to fucking argue.
So
there.
that's what's funny is because he's this isn't about partisanship, but let me give you this very specific partisanship against Democrats doing the exact same thing. And it's if you were actually this quote unquote independent, you would be hey, both of these sides have committed a fucking war crime. But that's obviously not the case because Joe Lieberman is a fucking nutsack with
well,
legs.
let's just admit opinion sells. It's provocative.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's that's the thing about op-eds and editorials. It's at some point you have to realize the intersection of capital, and what sells is fucking opinion and provocativeness.
Right.
Yeah. He goes on to say, it is possible that anti-Trump partisanship isn't behind Democrats' reluctance to say that they're glad Soleimani is dead. It may be that today's Democratic Party simply doesn't believe in the use of force against America's enemies in the world. I don't believe that's true, but episodes like this one may lead many Americans to wonder whether it is true or not. If enough voters decide that Democrats can't be trusted to keep America safe, Mr. Trump won't have much trouble winning a second term in November. That's one more reason Democrats should leave partisan politics at the water's edge and, whatever their opinion of President Trump on other matters may be, stand together against Iran and dangerous leaders like Qasem Soleimani.
Let me tell you something. Joe Lieberman will and did 150,000,000% vote for Trump.
Again, it's like they're like presupposing the big other. You know what I mean? They're like saying like, no, there is a threat. There always has to be a threat. This is the threat. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like that's their entire ideology. He cannot step out of that. That's what his belief is. Even as a liberal, long-term liberal, as a Democrat, that's what his belief is that like there is a big other out there. There is an Iran. There's an Iraq. There's like something out there that we need to be taken care of, a threat to our existence, you know?
Yeah. It's fucked, folks. So, well, I also have a cursed liberal opinion for you all. This one comes hot off the press from Twitter. Got a shit ton of retweets and likes. And it states, in relation to the current conflict going on with Iran right now, toxic masculinity is putting the entire world at risk. And he goes on. This whole situation is one of weak men needlessly escalating situations to look tough and refusing to back down even when countless lives depend on it. Donald Trump is the poster boy of this approach, as if we had elected Hillary, we would not already be at war with Iran and Russia. Hold on. I'm not done. Hold on. Just admit you fucked up. Apologize for carrying out an assassination and call on Congress to pass legislation to stop any president from putting us in this situation again. Yeah, because that's what Trump would do. Have the courage to de-escalate the situation and prevent it from continuing to happen.
Well, I just want to say to that in response, this is totally like id poll liberal nonsense.
Yes, total shit.
Obviously. But the thing is like, this is what distracts people from understanding that there's like a class dynamic, like more than anything else, whether like or not this is, you know, toxic masculinity that causes Trump to do this stuff or that causes the U.S. government to do this type of stuff. It's less important than the material drives to wage war, to wage imperialism, to manufacture munitions and weaponry. Like, more than the toxic masculinity involved, and I'm sure there is some, you know, the patriarchy and all that stuff, all these, warlike drives to do these things, but at the helm of it all is the profit motive, and this is the thing that makes, you know, this kind of a take so nebulous and boring. Really, it's just there's no bite to it. It's like, okay. Basically, you could have just summarized that article by saying "Orange Man bad."
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think like I don't want to be. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is an absolutely cursed opinion. I don't want to be disingenuous. I mean, this person did also go on to like blame what they said. Like they said like the economic system. They didn't name the economic system. But blame the economic system, although they didn't name it, for contributing to potential war with Iran. But like to me, this is exactly why the right is winning. I mean, this take is fucking horrendous, and I feel like acts, you know, as if someone like, say, again, like I said earlier, like if Hillary was president, you know, like we wouldn't already be at war
Everything
with Iran or
fine.
Russia.
Liberals would not be complaining.
Right,
Liberals would be like, "Oh yes, slay queen."
But I mean,
kill those Iraqis and those
right,
Iranians.
Right. And I think it just shows the failure, you know, of like liberalism, or even liberalism that has like infected the left currently, to adopt like this rad lib cultural leftism with absolutely zero class analysis. And I think it just shows like, you know, the failure of liberalism and like the left that it's kind of like infiltrated, you know, which has largely adopted this sort of like rad lib cultural leftism that has absolutely zero class analysis that would equip it to be able to deduce the central aim of imperialism, or, you know, as we've said in previous episodes, the highest stage of capitalism, as a famous Russian activist once said. And they can just deduce that so easily to fucking toxic masculinity because all elements of like class analysis have been completely stripped from their arguments like as a whole.
I think that's it for our cursed liberal opinions. So, do we have a literal king?
Yeah, we're going to
For this
spotlight
week?
someone this week.
So for this segment, we're moving to a literal king of the week. And I got to give it to my boy Hassan Nasrallah, leader of the revolutionary Hezbollah. No, I'm just kidding. It's not.
It was like, oh man, where's this going?
No.
Off script a
No,
little bit.
satirical purposes only. Satirical purposes only. But no, I'm actually going to give it to Mike Preisner of Party for Socialism and Liberation. Shout out to them. He's an Iraq war veteran and major U.S. anti-war activist. I'm sure if you're on left Twitter, left Facebook, whatever, you've seen some of his like videos that have gone viral.
Yeah.
Active communist, and again, PSL member. And he just stated this in combating media and kind of political narratives regarding the justification of Soleimani's killing, stating that people blaming Soleimani for hundreds of American deaths are referring to when the U.S. illegally invaded and occupied Iraq and was unleashing daily brutal violence on civilians, and the Iraqi people desperately sought support to justifiably and legitimately defend themselves in their homes. I say this as someone who, while in Iraq, probably had Iranian munitions shot at me, so spare me the quote-unquote great disservice I'm doing to our soldiers.
Beautiful
Just
take.
just absolute king, just absolute boss. I mean that's it.
Just
that's
put it
it
out there, like we are illegally invaded and occupied their country, and as much as the U.S. war machine and media apparatus wants to drum up like that these people are terrorists or bad people, like this is all for the pursuit of profit. Like don't get it twisted. Like this is all profit motive.
And there you go. That's a soldier who admits that. That's
right.
Someone who was there. That's like, yes,
this is someone who like literally became a communist after serving in Iraq.
Yeah,
like he was like a right wing, like let me serve my country post 9/11 type kid, and then came back from the war and was like literally bring the war home.
I mean,
bitches.
and obviously we don't want to do like an appeal to authority fallacy here, but like this means something that this person experienced this, had this recollection, and acknowledged that we're illegally occupying this country and doing a lot of things that are really not necessary. But look at whose pockets it's lining. Really, that's the point that we're trying to get across here.
Yeah. The main point of this show is that if you want to have a good opinion, you have to go join the military and kill some brown innocent kids.
Yeah, I don't know if I
plug in Pete Buttigieg's campaign
Pete Buttigieg.
ad.
Yeah, let's get the LGBTQ CIA plus opinion on this matter.
Yeah, that'll be our next segment. Anyway, yeah, that's my literal king. Just absolutely fire take. So,
congrats. He's a Tampa local too. Did you know
Is
that?
he really?
Yeah, they're from around here. Yeah,
I remember he was there like in the 2012 Occupy Wall Street, or the RNC protest. Sorry, not Occupy. Anyway, moving on to our final segment, having a normal one. I actually have one from the Washington Post, and it's not an opinion piece, folks.
Oh God, it's real news.
It's hot,
legitimate news.
It's hot off the press. It's coming from the editorial board.
For people that may be wondering why we're doing these segments, is because I think it's particularly important to like point out with direct evidence of media pieces and editorials and things like that to describe just the absurdity of the media.
These things are out there. Like we're not just making them up,
right.
Reacting.
We're not here to talk about it just to talk about it. Like here it is. Here's a concrete example. Anyway, this is the Washington Post editorial board having an absolute normal one. This statement. Oh, and I love it too because it says at the top, the Washington Post. Democracy dies in darkness.
Yeah.
Anyway, title of the piece, Maduro's latest ploy failed, but it's a bad sign. He's hunkering down with Putin's help. Oh, get ready, folks. Strap in. Anyway, so I'll read through this quickly. An attempt by Venezuelan ruler Nicolas Maduro to strip his opposition of
Ruler.
Yeah.
He was democratically
Yeah,
elected.
no. Anytime you hear ruler or regime, that's
It's
U.S.
bullshit.
That's U.S. code for
we don't like
fucking
you
hate this person
because you're trying to nationalize the oil and
Right.
keep the wealth of your country
Yep.
owned by the people who live there rather than U.S. corporations.
Right. I've never heard fucking whatever his name is in Saudi Arabia as a regime. Anyway, an attempt by Venezuelan ruler Nicolas Maduro to strip his opposition of control over the National Assembly through force and fraud mostly fell flat this week. Dozens of countries, including Latin American governments sympathetic to the Maduro regime, none of which are listed, rejected the supposed election of a formerly obscure legislature as assembly president Sunday after opposition delegates were forcibly excluded. Meanwhile, 100 of the 167 members, false numbers, gathered at a newspaper office. They don't name which one because it's El Nacional, an extreme right-wing newspaper in Venezuela, and re-elected opposition leader Juan Guaido. On Tuesday, the opposition majority regained control of the assembly chamber and swore in Mr. Guaido as president, even as the regime's nominee fled. Just skipping forward a little bit in this article, states, a year ago when the Trump administration joined other governments in recognizing Mr. Guaido as president and then suspended U.S. purchases of Venezuelan oil.
I wonder what this is all about.
It appeared the regime might soon collapse, but after weathering a failed uprising launched by Mr. Guaido in April, the regime quieted the streets with brutal oppression. Ah, yes, because basically, Guaido could not gain any mass popular support. Also, his fucking National Assembly members or sympathetic members were fucking burning aid from the fucking UN that were coming in there, which the New York Times, the failing New York Times, had to walk back their stories originally that they had reported that the Maduro regime had done. Anyway, so Mr. Guaido in April, the regime quieted down the streets, brutal repression. It partly stabilized the economy by abandoning its price import controls and allowing the dollar to become a substitute currency. It repeated revenues from drug trafficking and gold mining, including by Colombian guerrilla groups. So you heard it here, folks. Since they can't make any money off oil anymore, the Maduro regime has switched to drug trafficking and gold mining from Colombian guerrilla groups. Maybe they wouldn't have to do that if you would not fucking sanction a democratically elected government.
So, I mean, this article, like, I've heard enough personally, but I just want to say, any reasonable person who understands the history of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, or understands the way that their economy is set up, understands that, this is kind of like framing and posturing by the U.S. media to represent the Venezuelan government or the Maduro quote-unquote regime as some type of like enemy or other, as we discussed in the editorial bias and filtering earlier. But really, like, what they're obscuring here is the deep historical context of the problem. Now, the sanctions and all of this stuff, this article talks about it very little. You know what I mean? And it's almost framed post hoc as, anti-Maduro and all of this stuff, but they're giving you a very, very curated, purposeful misdirection when they're talking about, these objectives here. So
I know you feel like you've heard enough. Let me just say, this has all been vanilla shit. So let me cut forward. Let me fast forward a little bit. Okay. Elliot Abrams, the State Department's Elliot Abrams, the State Department's special envoy for Venezuela, said Monday that Russian companies are now handling 70% of Venezuelan oil. They market it, they finance it, they hide it, ship it to transfers, changing the name of boats and turning off transponders, because we totally don't do that with Saudi Arabian oil.
So, I mean, here's the scoop here. The U.S. media basically decides what the imperial interests or the capital interests of the U.S. are, and then they frame and posture the narrative to seem as if everyone else, Russia, China, Maduro, are all at odds with the U.S., but it's quite clear to see that it's really just, it's really just like a market war for resource dominance.
And let me just get to the final paragraph of this piece. It's truly golden. The regime of Vladimir Putin will be rewarded with a new client state in the Western Hemisphere, along with nearly exclusive access to some of the world's largest oil reserves. This would be a stinging defeat for President Trump, who has made the restoration of democracy in Venezuela one of his signature goals.
Yeah, by instituting like a CIA coup with someone, Guaido, who was not elected, who was not even in the race for the presidency, versus Maduro, who was democratically elected by popular vote, which arguably their electoral system is more democratic than the U.S. electoral system because they don't have things like electoral college and different things
voter
like
suppression law.
voter suppression and incongruent or inconsistent representation based on population size. So these are facts that they conveniently don't put in, and so you're framed to see the narrative as Russia and China and Maduro versus U.S. free market forces, but it's not that.
These articles are written in a way where it's like, we're going to complain right now about Venezuela, but just ignore all the hypocrisies that the U.S. might have in this situation. We're just focusing on this. And that's that's the downside, is that like these articles are only written with like, oh, here's the bad guy in mind. They're not written with like, has the U.S. done anything comparable in the past?
Right, exactly.
And then the fact that they call it like Venezuela oil trafficking. Right. Like they're depriving the U.S. of something. Yeah. But the U.S. is literally the U.S. is responsible for all of these problems and this economic situation.
But it's like when Venezuela engages in trade with Russia to literally keep its economy afloat. Yeah, it's trafficking.
It's trafficking.
When the US it's a regime with a ruler who's trafficking.
Yeah, but when the U.S. literally invades a sovereign nation of Iraq and occupies them for literally ever for the sake of oil infrastructure, that's not trafficking or a cartel at all.
Or engages with a country that dismembered a fucking Washington Post or whatever Wall Street Journal. Is Washington Post journalist? Like
abroad?
Khashoggi, They fucking, this is the editorial board saying this after one of their fucking members abroad was cut to pieces by this fucking insane dictatorship in Saudi Arabia that also did 9/11 that we cannot speak about because of their fucking connections with the U.S.
That we're allied with. Yeah.
It's so
that we give resources to.
It's so disgusting. But anyway, let me just finish this last piece. Again, this would be a stinging defeat for President Trump, who has made the restoration of democracy in Venezuela one of his signature goals. How to prevent such a defeat? Military action, which Mr. Trump has sometimes hinted at. It's not a realistic option, but Mr. Trump could impose a cost on Russia for its meddling, such as, listen, guys, hold on, such as by increasing sanctions on the state oil company Rosneft for its Venezuelan oil trafficking.
Yikes.
The coming months may tell. Hold on, guys. You ready? It's about to get real woke. The coming months may tell whether Mr. Trump values regime change in Venezuela more than his affinity for Mr. Putin.
Oh
wow.
Oh, my God.
Cursed.
That's the ultimate.
That's
cursed. That's cursed. It's,
opinion.
It's having a normal one.
Jesus Christ.
Everything is just like a simplified narrative of good guy versus bad guy. America's the greatest. We've never done anything wrong. Every action we've taken is justified, and we're the rightful police force for the world. Do you buy it? I don't.
It's disgusting. I mean, it's so funny because they're like basically hinting at the end that if Trump doesn't escalate tensions with Russia, then he's a Putin bot. You know?
So this is what manufacturing consent does. Like, this is the point, is to basically tell you, oh, you're anti-war, you're just unpatriotic. This is what they did during the Iraq invasion. This is what they're doing again. And it's all the media apparatus.
The Washington Post wasn't the only one this week who was having a very, very normal one.
Oh, God.
Military.com published an article this week
Oh, God.
that said,
Wow. What a
Let me
source.
just-
Military.com.
let's just quote the title first here. Iran may have a fleet of communist killer dolphins.
Okay, first of all, enlist them immediately.
Yeah.
Bring them on the pod.
Shit,
Interviews.
they found us
immediately.
out.
Yo, we need to have those communist dolphins on the pod.
Yes. Okay.
And I'm going to
Friend of the
preface
pod,
this.
communist dolphin.
I'm going to preface this. I have no idea where this fits into like the filters of media. I
Right.
don't know why. I don't know if they're just appealing to like certain buzzwords. I don't know if this is like actual propaganda, but it exists. It's
Think
out
of the
there.
type
So-
of right winger that would click on this article and just like have a field day.
So,
they live in Clearwater, Florida.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna skip around. I've cut this
dolphins.
down a little bit. So in 2000, the Islamic Republic acquired a number of dolphins from Russia. One specially trained to attack enemy ships, according to the BBC. The dolphins had originally been trained by
Putin.
the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Listen, that hasn't existed for like 30 plus
91,
years.
yeah.
The international working class will
Dolphin.
be the human race of dolphins.
When funding for the project ran out, the dolphins were acquired by their former trainer, who moved them to a dolphinarium, which I think is a place where you fuck dolphins.
Sick.
I think.
Dolphins do like to fuck
Don't
people.
quote me on that. I've seen that.
Let's
before.
Yeah,
not-
the dolphin
That's scary.
rape thing.
Let's not get
Anyway.
on this tangent.
So public interest in this dolphinarium waned, and their caretaker was forced to sell them when he eventually ran out of food.
Right.
So in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the dolphin unit was
Dolphin unit.
the dolphin.
SVU special. What is it? SDU special dolphin
Dolphins
unit.
The dolphin unit was sent to the Crimea. That's a buzzword
Crimea.
nowadays. Crimea
Crimea
Peninsula from a base in the Russian Pacific area.
Comrade Flipper.
Comrade Flipper.
There, the dolphins were trained to kill enemy frogmen using harpoons mounted on their backs.
Were these gay frogmen?
Yes.
A la Alex Jones.
Yeah.
They would also swim at enemy ships in suicide attacks while carrying explosive sea mines, as they were able to distinguish between Russian and American submarines by the sounds their propulsion systems make underwater.
I want to
Sure.
meet these dolphins.
Yeah.
Heroes.
Yeah, which it makes them more discerning than the U.S. drone strikes that seem to favor innocent brown kids over actual terrorists.
Oh my god.
That's my little editorial.
Oh,
note.
that's
No,
your,
God.
that's your that's your
not from the-
artistic.
I was like,
license.
damn, hot take for military.com.
Yeah.
So anyway, these highly trained killer dolphins were moved from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf after Iran purchased them for reasons unknown. According to the Russian newspaper, Zurid, who is the dolphin trainer's, his work, which supposedly continued in Iran after the 2000 sale, was solely of a military nature. Depending on the types of dolphins used by Zurid, the original animals could still be alive, as dolphins have a lifespan of 50 years or more. He could also have trained more killer dolphins for use against Western shipping.
Honestly,
oh God,
I
Western
think-
shipping. It's at stake here.
Like the liberal, like it's almost like the liberal psyche is like an ad lib thing. It's at this point, it's just like everything is replaceable by the word Trump or Putin or whatever Russian hacker. It's just nonsense.
While the United States protested the sale of arms, or in this case, killer dolphins, to Iran, Zurid cared only about the dolphins. Quote, I am prepared to go to Allah or even to the devil as long as my animals will be okay there, he said. Which, like, just to wrap it up on a more serious note there, is that, like, it feels like that last paragraph that I read off here was solely just to show, like, are these people unreasonable? Are they selling weapons to Iran, like for this Allah, so that they can totally fucking have their animals survive over the cost of American human lives? It's like it's just. I don't feel like this article is written in complete malice, but I feel like it was written with the idea of like Iran. Oh, that's trending right now. Oh, communism. Oh, that's always trending. Let's make sure we can get all these buzzwords into one thing. It's clickbait. There's no doubt. But at the same time, it gets you in the sort of in the motion of thinking like, wow, these crazy Iranians, these crazy Arab people over there.
Well, it's like the whole thing where they're like, I mean, that's even historical. It's like, oh, Stalin was trying to create like a fucking ape army to, like kill Americans and shit. It's like, okay, it doesn't surprise me that now we're talking about dolphins or whatever. It's all fucking cool, honestly, and I want to meet all of them and engage all of them and make them a part of the great proletarian revolution.
I'd be honored to get harpooned by one of those dolphins.
Yeah. What I think is really
That'd be
interesting about that
actually.
particular article, though, is like we talk about like liberals always talk about like sources and like legitimacy and authority of sources. But it's just like that article in particular is sort of a testament to how like absurd and bullshit media is in general, that someone can just write an article like that with no substantive information and just publish it because they have the means to do so.
Right.
But it kind of throws in a wrench in this idea of like authorship and authority in terms of media. Like, if you're going to lend credence to or suppose that some particular outlet is an authority, and not question their, profit motive or the way that they're selling this information or marketing this information, I really don't think that you're doing your due diligence to try to understand the full scope of the apparatus and the interests at play that shape the world that we live in.
Yeah, when you read the article, like it feels like it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a little bit speculative. He's kind of open about like, maybe this is a thing, maybe this isn't. But at the same time, it just makes you feel like, why do they have to get this narrative in? Like, who is setting this quota where it's like, you need to talk about Iran this week, so make sure you write an article, and he feels the need to write something like this.
It's basically like neo-McCarthyism.
Right. Honestly, that's why I found it so funny, and I feel like we all had like a humorous time in our fucking group chat or whatever about the MEK, and like they're like literally like they're like a 2009 Glenn Beck like
wet
conspiracy rant, but they're all supported by the far right. I mean, they are extremely reactionary now, but like,
but how do you break this down? There is literally a are they communist Marxists?
They're a Islamist
Marxist
group,
and guess who they're funded by?
Right.
The Bushes, and now maybe probably the Trumps.
Right.
It's like, how could you have any more of a self-contradictory worldview than to be supporting Islamic Marxists in their ability to overthrow Iran? Like, how more asinine can it get?
Honestly, folks,
it's just like they're telling on themselves.
It's a good place to be.
I think on that note, we should end this dumpster fire.
Yeah. Hold on. Before we end it, just going around, why is everyone sipping that daddy juice this week?
Well,
politically,
why I'm drinking?
Politically speaking,
honestly, this work week was hard, and I'm tired, and I want to get loose.
Hell yeah,
straight up.
Yeah, damn. I mean, at this point, news just travels so fast. There's no time to get caught up.
Right.
We get a few moments a day, and it's like, it's so stressful to deal with all this shit.
Yeah.
It's like,
I'm becoming like,
what else are you gonna do on a Friday night? Besides
more and more like nihilistic
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just like we see the just absurdity and disgusting behavior of the media outlets and how they drum up support for war, manufacture consent, and it's just kind of makes you want to just like end it all sometimes.
Yeah, I think that for me, it's the fact that, I mean, obviously Soleimani was killed. That was brutal. Potential war with Iran, sure. But honestly, yeah, it's kind of the shitty media coverage, mainly because there is no way to spin this to advocate it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, at least in 2003 with the Iraq war, like, they weaponized like Americans, like, hatred of fucking Muslims, basically, and not being able to tell the difference between any Muslim country from the other. to drum up like hatred and conspiracy with Saddam Hussein.
Well, I mean, most Americans can't even find Iran on a map.
Right. But it's like now, it's so many people are so anti-war. We're all over it. This killing happens. We're probably going to end up in some major conflict with Iran, if not Iran, some proxy war with all of them. So yeah, that's me.
It does feel like, if anything, it feels like America has at least learned a slight lesson from the Iraq War, and that's maybe one thing that we can be hopeful for in the future. So,
Possibly, yeah.
with that, guys, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. We want to wish you a very great night. And remember to check us out at Entry Level Left on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks so much.